Good. Thanks very much for inviting me to participate in the gathering. Awesome to be here. We've been here a few times over the years, not as often as Guy has, but we got busy schedules, and Julie Anderson was, so you only go places when you're invited to do something. And I'm like, oh, sorry, Julie. It's probably true. But 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Thanks, Guy. Thanks. Yeah, I was going to ask someone to do that, but got practicing for later on. Anyway, I'm Brother David Stiles from the Shelburne Ecclesia in Amaranth, Ontario. If you don't know where Amaranth is, Google it. There's a great story behind the name Amaranth, but I won't get into that right now because we're under some time constraints. Anyway, I'm a Stiles, so you probably think I'm from Detroit. I was actually born in Houston, Texas, and when I was 5, Mom and Dad moved to Detroit. My mom's New Yorker with German extraction, and my dad's parents were British Canadians. So I'm a mixed bag of treats. But I did grow up in the Detroit area. So for whatever reason, Detroit area sports teams imprinted on me. So I'm an ardent supporter of, all things Detroit and Michigan when it comes to sports. And of course, it was a bit sad to see Guy present the Ohio State T-shirts because, as we know, Michigan not only beat Ohio State, but won the national championship. I know. I'm just going to bask in that glory until it's over because it ain't going to last long. So the topic for this week is timely lessons from the Kings. And the picture we have here are excavations in Jerusalem in front of the Temple Mount. In 2019, we had an opportunity to visit Israel for the second time. A brother and sister in our area wanted us to go with them. They had never been to Israel. It was really cute. The first trip we took with them was on a cruise. And they are like hardcore cruisers. And Mary and I are not, never been on one. So we went on this cruise with them. It was on one of the biggest cruise boats. It was, kind of through the Western Caribbean. And honestly, it was okay. Not our jam. I felt like, I understand what a cow feels like when it's on one of those big ships, kind of herded on and off. And you know what? It was what it was. But when they said, let's go to Israel, we were like, yes, we'd love to do that. Mary and I had gone to Israel on our honeymoon, so it was 30 years later, thereabouts, that we went back. And fantastic trip. And the degree to which the Israelis have been, working away through archaeology to uncover their history. It's just fantastic, and the things getting found are absolutely amazing, and it's ongoing, and new things come to light all the time. And this first class is about how do we know the stories are true? What is the historicity of the Old Testament record? And that is something that, at this point in time, with everything that's been found, is absolutely unassailable. So, anyway, this is just a breakdown of the classes, which I do believe you have in the program. So, so this class is, if you're an archaeological, junkie, this will be kind of cool. If it's, not cool to you, you might nod off. That's okay. And don't say it's not fair, because keep it sorted that out. At any rate, what this is a, they say don't put too much information on a PowerPoint. It's like, what the heck is this? This is like the PowerPoint on steroids. But anyway, it is the kings. So the kings of Israel is in the yellow, the kings of Judah, the green, And then interspersed, and this is where, gets a little mind-blowing, are the contemporary kings of Syria. The very top thin line is the kings of Assyria. And then you get into the Median kings, and then at the bottom is the Babylonian kings. And then interspersed is in the middle are the different prophets that ministered. So the reason I throw this at you, and it's just something you're going to have to look at at your leisure, if you're into this kind of thing, is how busy this era was. Not only for Israel and Judah, because the kingdom, as we know, had been divided after the failures of Solomon, but for the entire Middle East. This was a really kind of the hot and burning center of the globe at that time. This is where civilization began. And one thing that I always find fascinating and remarkable is as often as they find a fire pit someplace in France or a cave drawing that they somehow managed to date to 50,000 years ago, everyone agrees that civilization as we know it basically appeared about 4000 BC in Mesopotamia and in Egypt. That's where it all began. And as much as people would like to suggest something else or something different, what they find in terms of, hard, cold facts in the ground and on it corroborates the biblical record. It always has and always will. It's just inescapable. So it's just fascinating to consider how the Bible consistently aligns with what gets found. Now, as to these, very old, Paleolithic, Neolithic things, we'll get answers for that when the Lord returns. One thing I always find quite amazing when they find these cave drawings, these are supposedly early man, Cro-Magnon, possibly interbreeding with Neanderthal, and possibly interbreeding with Denisovanians who somehow cropped up with a tooth in some Malaysian cave, I don't know, is that they were producing sophisticated works of art which were highly symbolic. So you tell me how some, who was walking around, antelope, me killed, then walks into a cave and produces art. I mean, that's absolutely nuts. So whatever it is and whatever was going on, we know that as a species, we were sophisticated and intellectual from the moment we rose from the earth. That's the facts. And nobody can tell us different. So anyway, that's my little tanty for the day. At any rate, as we obviously, there's just so much material. We've picked out a few examples of some kings to learn lessons from, and it's hardly an exhaustive story. One thing that's been a criticism of the biblical record is this intense focus on Israel and Judah. And a lot of historians and archaeologists are like, the Bible just makes out like these kingdoms were just like everything and nothing else existed and it was just all Judah and Israel and do we even know they existed? You get some intense criticism of the biblical record. In actual fact, when you read the record of the kings, it's quite evident that Israel and Judah were enmeshed in a much bigger picture. The Bible references almost incidentally the big players of the day, and God brings them in as He sees fit to deal with His people and His narrative. No one's suggesting there wasn't, some big global things going on. That was, just simply a fact. And the Bible acknowledges it and references different names of different kings at different times of different nations. So there's always, I find, amongst the critics, a willingness to distort what, in fact, the Bible says and how it says it. And when we're careful Bible readers, we realize actually quite the opposite is true. So, all right. So this is a map of the Middle East. It depicts what's called the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The different colors reflect the expansion of the Assyrian Empire, which it was more just the map and show you where everything was, which hopefully we're all familiar with. Anyway, one issue that is very much true of the king's record is the constant looming presence of the Assyrian. They loom large in Israel's history until almost the very end when, and this is kind of a cool reflection on what was going on. If you recall the story of Josiah, which we're not going to talk about this week, but we all remember Josiah, the boy king, who was an ardent follower of the Lord and found the book of the law. And Josiah made a terrible mistake at the end of his life, and he went to interfere in the progress of the Egyptian army from Egypt, and it was moving through, Israel and Judah to actually support the Assyrians in their fight against the Babylonians. It was one of the epiphanal watershed moments of history. And it was one of those moments where Josiah would have been better off to have stayed home. Because when you talk about what's fair, in effect, God was, having this all play out for his purpose to further his end. And Josiah really put himself in God's way, and he suffered, the ultimate fate. But what the Egyptians were doing was moving up to Carchemish to support the Assyrian because the Babylonian was on the rise. And in the Battle of Carchemish, this was when Nebuchadnezzar won an amazing victory, an unexpected victory over the Assyrian, and destroyed its power. Until then, the Assyrian had dictated a lot of what happened during the history of the kings. And it's going to come up a number of times as we look at the lives of these individuals. But the Assyrian was the dominant player, and basically its footprint was all over this part of the world, and really ranks as many would identify the Assyrian as the first of the great empires that really was going to eventually, flow into the development of Western institutions in the Western world. Which is all part of Nebuchadnezzar's image. But there is an emphasis on Assyria and the role it played in the nation of Israel. So it is worth our attention. And of course, if you are familiar with a little bit of history and how the Assyrians rolled, it ranks as one of the most brutal, callous, and cruel nations that have ever existed. The Assyrians had a nasty habit of treating its enemies with an intense barbarity. So on the one hand, you have this civilization that's responsible for some of the most amazing architecture, the most amazing works of art on just a huge scale. But when they went to war, they struck terror in the hearts of everyone they met. I won't get into all the gory details. You can read it for yourself. But let's just say, if cyanide had existed back then, you would have been better off biting a pill than falling into the hands of the Assyrian, because they'd make sure you died slow and you died painfully if you stood in their way. So they were not nice guys. That's the Assyrian. So what we're going to do is just go through a series of findings that affirm the biblical record and assure us that what we're reading did in fact actually happen. It is not the product of oral tradition. It is not a fuzzy recollection recorded by scribes hundreds of years after the fact. These are contemporary accounts of what was going on. And there's one book that's well worth reading. The author's name is William Dever. He calls himself a kind of an ex-Baptist. He grew up a devout Christian and got into he's an biblical analyst and student and archaeologist. Anyway, he's an atheist now, whatever. But he wrote a book, What Did the Biblical Writers Know and How Did They Know It? And despite his declension from Christianity, he is quite convinced that the biblical record was based on contemporary accounts that were written in real time. So if this guy thinks that's the case, as critically as he is, then to me it's quite an interesting affirmation of what we know to be true, is that this is the Bible's the real deal. Anyway, the first item, and again, some of you might be familiar with it, is the Maranatha stele. And this was a pharaoh of Egypt. He reigned from 1213 to 1203 BC. And there's a way of kind of keeping biblical history in your head a little bit. At least I do this. 1500 BC is Moses. 1000 BC is David, right? And then so that's about 350 years later, both kingdoms are over and the Babylonian captivity has taken place. All right, so just to kind of roughly orient yourselves. Now, another thing I was going to mention when we were looking at that timeline, one thing I did as a kid, didn't do this willingly, I was made to, is I memorized all the kings of Israel and Judah. And it was my aunt and uncle, Joe and Marie Banta, who did this, because I'd spent summers in Texas with with my aunt and uncle, my cousin, who was dead. Get up here and slap me, guys. All right, sorry. I said, I can tell this story and not get emotional. Anyway, we read through the kings, and every king we learned, we would then add it to our list, and we just slowly worked our way through, and we memorized them all. My cousin and I did. And we just loved to rattle them off. And whoever rattled them off quicker won. But it was so helpful for me personally to get a handle on this section of Scripture, because it's busy and there's lots going on. So, if you got nothing else to do in life and you're bored to tears and you don't have woodworking to attend to like Norbert and Skip, you can memorize the kings of Israel and Judah. It's absolutely awesome. And if you can kind of do it with your kids, they'll love you forever, because it really helps. Anyway, enough of that. Anyway, this was a finding from 1896, and it's the first reference, the earliest textual reference to Israel. All right, now that's huge. So this is before David and Saul. This is when Israel was ruled by the judges. And that was a very disorganized period of time in Israel's history, when, it was a judge after judge after judge. So the Egyptians had reason to reference Israel, and it's a powerful affirmation of the biblical record that in the middle of the judge period, when a lot of critics would like to tell you that, really Israel didn't exist, the Egyptians acknowledged it. So that's the earliest reference to Israel. Now, this I thought was really cool. This was recently found in Jerusalem in what they call the First Temple level. Okay, so the digging that's going on in Jerusalem is beginning to unearth some pretty unequivocal evidence for the First Temple. And the First Temple period is Solomon's Temple. So there's the First Temple period, and then the Second Temple period. The Second Temple period is what the Israel rebuilt under Ezra and Nehemiah, Zerubbabel and Joshua, and was eventually enhanced by Herod. That was the Second Temple. Now that's quite evident because of the Western Wall. No one doubts that. What is often the subject of skepticism is what Solomon claims to have built in Jerusalem, because it's presented as quite impressive structures. And they're like, well, where are they? How can we find them? We don't even see them. It's like, hey, Brock, they're old. Relax. And as Israel's had opportunity to dig, they're beginning to uncover things. One of the things they uncovered was a piece of jewelry, an earring. This is a little tiny jewel made of gold and silver alloy, little pendant, but it survived, and that's the era it's from. So if we wondered, were they there? Yeah, they were, and they had earrings too. So there you go. This is the Mesha steel, or the Moabite stone. This was an inscription that written by the Moabites that talks about how Moab was oppressed by Omri, king of Israel, and his son Ahab. So this is independent. This isn't written by the Israelites. This is not biblical. This is a separate parallel account. And it's an absolutely fascinating affirmation of what the Bible says. This was from the Moabite perspective, how they had to pay tribute to Omri and Ahab, and we're going to talk about Ahab. And along with the Moabite stone, there are two Assyrian stelae. They're called the Kirk monoliths. And they describe the period of two Assyrian kings, Ashurbanipal II and his son Shalmaneser III. And this describes a battle. It's the Battle of Karkar. And Ahab is mentioned in this Assyrian inscription as having provided 2,000 chariots and 10,000 foot soldiers to an anti-Assyrian coalition. All right? So whatever we may think of Ahab, and we're going to talk about this in the last class, Ahab the wily strategist. Ahab was actually, during his reign, a force to be reckoned with by surrounding powers. And what we're going to come to find out is that Ahab had a strategy of unifying the Syrians and aligning himself with them in order to counter Assyrian power and to keep it north of Israel. So Ahab enjoyed some degree of success in this policy, and his presence was acknowledged by the Assyrians themselves. So, a fascinating find, and one that again affirms the biblical record. Many of us may have heard of this. It's called the Tel Dan stele. And what this is a fragment of a stele from about the 9th century BC. It contains a Canaanite inscription in Aramaic, which details, interestingly, that an individual killed Jehoram of Israel, son of Ahab, and king of the house of David. And many feel it's probably the only extra biblical reference to the house of David, and that's one of the things that a lot of critics say is, if David's kingdom was so great, if Solomon's kingdom was even greater, why don't we have any references to them? Why isn't there more hard evidence that these men existed? So this is an example of some hard evidence that David existed. His house is referenced in this particular fragment. And not only that, but it confirms the fact that, this individual Jehoram, who we know to be King Jehoram, has been killed. And, of course, that was the work of Jehu. And when Elisha told Jehu to go and destroy the house of Ahab. So, story for another day. The point is, it references the house of David, and it does provide evidence for the existence of David and his rule. This particular fragment was incorporated into another building. It's not the building that the stele was found in originally. So when we ask ourselves, why is it hard to find evidence? Because it was commonplace to take apart and deconstruct buildings, monuments, temples, whatever, and build something new. What we do today in terms of, taking down old stuff and building new stuff, happened all the time historically. So when we look for evidence for verification of Old Testament stories, what we're dealing with is thousands of years of history of people doing what people do. And if they, instead of going and, making new stones for new buildings, they'll go and repurpose old stuff. So it's hard to find things. And this happened to be found. They recognized the writing, they translated it, and lo and behold, it said something remarkable. Just completely accidentally. It wasn't where it should have been. It wasn't where it was from originally. It was a repurposed piece of stone, and lo and behold, it tells us something important. And that's frequently the case. You go to these parts of the world that have been continuously occupied for so many millennia. This occurs over and over again. So when someone says, "Oh, we didn't find anything," okay, so, that happens all the time. And there's a saying in, archaeology: the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? So because we haven't found something yet, doesn't mean it's not there to be found. Now this is a really cool one. This is the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser. I believe it's in the British Museum. Shalmaneser reigned. He was Syrian monarch. 858 to 824 BC, reigned over Assyria. One thing that is interesting about the Assyrian army is that there was an old Assyrian empire and then what they call the new Assyrian empire. And it wasn't that they were two different empires, it's just that the Assyrian, during the early part of Israel's existence, was growing in power and influence and strength. Then it went through a period of decline and it fell into disarray. And when it finally managed to get its act together, that was the Assyrian Empire we're probably most familiar with. That's the Assyrian Empire that Sennacherib came from, that invaded Judah and really projected its power quite effectively. But Shalmaneser was earlier than that time period, but nonetheless, the Assyrian was still interacting with the nations around it. And at this particular moment in time, Israel had come under some form of subjugation to the Assyrian Empire. And it depicts Jehu, king of Israel, doing obeisance to this Assyrian monarch. So this actually, if you can see that, I hope you can see that. So do you see the person kneeling down, doing obeisance on the ground? Okay, this obelisk describes this individual as Jehu. Interestingly, he says Jehu of the house of Omri. I'll explain that in a second. So what would happen, and what was frequently the case in the interactions of these nations, is if you were a smaller, weaker nation, you might very well decide it was better to do obeisance and pay some form of tribute, in order to avoid being completely obliterated. You remember how Jehu came along and he had executed God's commission to destroy the house of Ahab, did it effectively, did it thoroughly, did it completely, but then turned around and continued to maintain the calf worship of Jeroboam. And God was, very angry with Jehu, said, "Well, you've obeyed me to a point, but I'm going to give you, I'll let your sons reign for 4 generations, and then you're going to disappear." And one of the other consequences was that God was not supportive of Jehu subsequent to him destroying the house of Ahab. One of the consequences was Jehu clearly had to work out some kind of accommodation with the Assyrian in order to avoid those very unfortunate consequences. And, Shalmaneser, for whatever reason, decides to record the event. Clearly, Jehu's obeisance and vassalage was worth noting by the Assyrians. So there was some, they knew Israel existed, they interacted with Israel, and they considered it a nation of some moment. not only does Jehu do this, but he's called the son of Omri. Right? But he wasn't Omri's son, was he? He actually destroyed the house of Omri. And what we're going to find when we look at the life of Ahab is that Ahab's father, Omri, had started this process of improving Israel's standing in the area. Omri moves the capital city to Samaria. He was an effective warrior. He, won the civil war that was going on. He proved to be a powerful and effective monarch in his own right. And he was so impressive that the surrounding kingdoms attached the name Omri to the reigning house of Israel due to his reputational standing. That's what was going on. So Jehu, even though he had obliterated the man's family, was identified by the Assyrian as being attached to this, what they would have considered a significant monarch in Israel's history. So, we read the biblical record, we get God's perspective. But when we look at some of these other monuments and evidences, we see someone else's perspective, and it was a little different. They saw things, from their vantage point, and this was one of the results of that. Now, another thing that is really cool and is found in abundance, particularly in the area of Jerusalem, are seals. So these were, I think we all know what a seal was. It was a means of identifying yourself. So if you were sending a missive or a letter or communication, you would, you'd have a signet ring and it identified you. You'd seal it so the person knew who the message was coming from. This particular seal actually belongs to this man Shema, who was a servant of Jeroboam II, who was actually a member of the house of Jehu. And it was found in Megiddo, so it was found in the right place. And it was, the seal was made from jasper. It was found in Megiddo in 1904. And it very clearly describes this individual. And they took a casting of the original, which unfortunately was lost. But they also found clay impressions of a similar seal. So they actually found the clay that had somehow survived and hardened, and they uncovered it in these excavations of this same individual. So he had apparently more than one signet ring and was quite prolific in communicating with whoever he communicated with. The point is this: is that these things are found all over. They're small, and when you look at how they manage an archaeological site, when you see how very careful they are with all the rubbish and all the scraps and all the gravel and all the sand and the dirt, and they shake it through these tiny sieves, these are the kinds of things they're looking for, and they find them, and it provides us with affirmation of the biblical record. Another king that is attested to in archaeology a number of times is Uzziah. And you remember Uzziah, he was the son of Amaziah. Uzziah had a very long and prosperous reign, but he ended it by doing something very foolish when he tried to go into the temple and offer sacrifices, which was, of course, the role of the Levitical priests, and he was chased out by the high priest and the other priests and then smitten with leprosy in his forehead. So that was this Uzziah. And he was... At this point in history, Uzziah was enjoying God blessed him. He was enjoying Judah was enjoying a period of prosperity and power. Uzziah was able to project power in the area. And so he gets acknowledged. And one of the kings that acknowledges him is Tiglath-Pileser III. In his records, he mentions Azariah several times. Interestingly, Tiglath-Pileser III is the first king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. He's the one who pulls it together and begins to put Assyria back on a winning track. And one of the things that Tiglath-Pileser had to deal with was during this period of Assyrian weakness, these smaller kingdoms became, quite aggressive and began to, form coalitions and and conquer territory and enjoy these periods of prosperity and power. And Uzziah was one of these monarchs, and he gets acknowledged as such. And along with these references, a seal of Sebanayu was found, and he is described as a servant of Uzziah. So just another example of the things that are found all the time that where names are named, and individuals who we find them listed in the Bible are found in amongst the dirt of the land. Another thing that's of note about Uzziah, Amos refers to the earthquake during the time of Uzziah, and this is kind of interesting because it's just an incidental reference to this earthquake, and yet it turns out that it was a significant event in this part of the world when it occurred. There's evidence all throughout Israel of a lot of destruction at this point in time, and it corroborates this incidental comment in the Bible that there was an earthquake and it caused a lot of damage. So and it became a marker for a lot of the for individuals at the time that this disaster had occurred. So to me, what it speaks to is when we look at history from a divine perspective. God's interested in certain things, and he pays attention to certain things. This earthquake occurred, caused a lot of damage, gets mentioned, but then not dwelt on scripturally. But when they go into the land, they find a lot of evidence for it. So just one of those corroborations that is reassuring that what we're reading is real-time history. Probably one of the most famous findings in the Middle East is the inscription removed from Hezekiah's conduit. And does everyone know what I mean by Hezekiah's conduit? This was the channel that Hezekiah had carved through solid rock to take the water of the Gihon spring, funnel it through this conduit into the city, to protect it from the Assyrian invaders so they would not find water. So this was deemed one of the most significant engineering projects in ancient history. Despite all the Egyptian pyramids and everything else, obviously there was a lot going on. But the ability they had to start at two ends and meet in the middle is they still don't know how they did it, and yet we know they did. If anyone's been to Israel, has anyone walked through Hezekiah's conduit? Has anyone had that opportunity? All right, well, before it's too late, of course, if the Lord returns, we can probably do it then. But it is one of the most fantastic experiences. Water rushes through. It's a little intimidating. But you look at the walls and you can see all the chisel marks of Hezekiah's men. It's just real-time evidence of what the Bible describes. At the end, they wrote an inscription commemorating the completion of this project. And unfortunately, and this was often the case, 100 years ago, late 1800s, a lot of individuals would find things, they recognized them to be of value, would remove, would remove them, very carelessly. And unfortunately, this inscription was a victim of that. So it's damaged, and they don't have the full inscription. But what there is translatable, and it describes what happened. How this is the story of the tunnel. The axes were against each other. 3 cubits were left to cut. They talks about them hearing each other as they got closer, and then it describes the dimensions and how the water flowed. Absolutely, this was what Hezekiah's men wrote to commemorate this event. You can go there, you can see this stone. It's all real, and it all happened. One of the most famous records that is not biblical is Sennacherib's Annals. There were 3 of these prisms discovered describing Sennacherib's campaign against Israel and Judah. And this is recorded in 2 Kings 18 and 19. And this is the famous story of Sennacherib and his version of events when he invaded Judah. And it talks about, how he treated Hezekiah. He says he had not submitted to my authority. And when we look at the story of Hezekiah, we're going to look at how Hezekiah tried to undo the damage his father had done, Ahaz, who was one of the wickedest kings of Israel. Sennacherib describes how he besieged and captured 46 of his fortified cities, smaller towns, the plunder, the people. And he says, as for Hezekiah, I shut him up like a caged bird in his royal fortress of Jerusalem. I then constructed a series of fortresses. I did not allow anyone to come out of the city gates. His towns, which I captured, I gave to, Mittai, king of Ashdod, etc. What everyone acknowledges, a biblical scholar and a secular historian, is that Sennacherib does not describe capturing Hezekiah. And that would absolutely have been noted in this record of the events. Hezekiah is left as a bird in Jerusalem, and that's the end of Sennacherib's story, because he had to leave the job unfinished because God destroyed his army. Sennacherib was never going to mention that, but he couldn't claim to have destroyed Jerusalem or captured Hezekiah. There's a famous relief describing the siege of Lachish, which was going on while, the Rabshakeh was negotiating with Hezekiah. And that is described and depicted in gory detail, what the Assyrians did to Lachish. They, showed the spears with the heads impaled. One of the Assyrian tricks was to, their captives, after they tortured them, they'd behead them, and they'd bundle all the heads and just fire them across the city walls to intimidate the inhabitants. Now, that's how they rolled. That's all described on these reliefs, but not Jerusalem. So, Sennacherib unwittingly affirms what we know to be the case, and that is he didn't finish the job. And then lastly, this is quite an interesting, another stele, another monument. This one was carved by Esarhaddon, who was one of the sons of Sennacherib. And as you recall, Sennacherib's sons killed him while he was worshiping in the temple 20 years after he had invaded Judah. But nonetheless, Esarhaddon was the Assyrian monarch during the time of Manasseh. And if you remember what happened to Manasseh, who was the son of Hezekiah, Manasseh was one of the wickedest kings of Judah. He was an appalling individual, and God was so angry with him, he arranged for Manasseh to be captured by the Assyrian, and he was brutalized by them. And while in captivity, Manasseh went through a remarkable conversion, repented, and was released and came back to Jerusalem, unfortunately too late to undo the damage he had done after 50 years of appalling idolatry and cruelty. Manasseh himself was treated cruelly. This is one of those monuments that doesn't specifically mention Manasseh. Most of them will name names, but in this instance, there were 2 individuals that Esarhaddon had captured. One was the Tirhakah's son, so this was the Egyptian pharaoh. Egypt was invaded, and the monarch's son was taken into captivity. And then it depicts what the Bible describes as Esarhaddon's treatment of Manasseh. So the general conclusion is that this actually describes the king of Judah, who was Manasseh. So some say, well, he's not named, but he's depicted. He's a Semite, and it shows the when he was, like, I think a hook was put in his jaw and he was hauled off. Anyway, that was what's described and depicted, and the general conclusion is that this is in fact Manasseh. So it's the last slide I have, and I'm pretty much out of time. At any rate, the point of this was to a bit of a review as to how the biblical record and the stories that we read of are real history. And it's not that the history or the fact that they're historical, affects the import of the spiritual lessons, which really is the point of these classes. But for myself personally, I find it very reassuring, particularly in this day and age of intense skepticism and intense secularism in the world that we live in, that we can rest assured that the accounts we read are true and real. These people existed and their stories happened. And one of the conclusions we can draw, and this has to do with literary analysis and how something's written and what conclusions we can draw. It would be highly unusual for this collection of books we call the Bible to have these long stretches of accurate, historical, real stories. And then for whatever reason, the authors to distort them all with fanciful accounts. Yeah, that is not how we record history. It's not what people tend to do. You don't. So, for example, you might have heard of the Gilgamesh epics. Those were the Babylonian accounts of creation and the flood and their mythology and their pantheon and their gods. And some bright spark decided to conclude that the biblical record was somehow inspired by the Gilgamesh epics because there was a lot of parallels in some of the stories. When you read the Gilgamesh epics, they're bizarre. They're just nuts. They're mythological. They're distorted. They're fanciful. They're you could turn them into a sci-fi movie without adjusting the narrative. That's not the biblical record. It's measured, it's meticulous, it's consistent, reads the same from start to finish. The record God gave us is a reasonable account and an accurate one of what happened. And we can be comforted by that fact and enjoy reading our Bibles knowing we're not reading the distorted outpouring of probably, drug-affected people's minds, but rather God himself. Thank you.